There is a fine line between purpose and obsession. Having a purpose is a driving force of passion, duty, and belief. Purpose moves us forward and grounds us when we need to be steadfast. When we lack purpose, we search for it or create it anew. But what happens when that purpose begins to command rather than inspire? When purpose, instead of being a guiding force, fully consumes the person, twisting noble intentions into profane compulsion. What makes you cross that line? Is it desire? Devotion? Maybe one action that tips the scales into cursed obsession? Well, let's find out. In my last monster deep dive on the grotesque, I explored how the gaping dragon of Dark Souls 1 came to be, how it had fallen from grace, and how its once majestic heritage turned into a beast maddened and twisted by gluttony, leaving it as nothing more than a vessel for an ever-hungering maw. A monster also transformed by a cursed obsession. As I mentioned in that video, I thought about turning this into a series where I keep exploring monster designs, their backstories, and whatever interesting facts I can find about them. That video seemed to be pretty well received, so here's the next one. Since I didn't just want to pull out random monsters, I want to go with a theme. For this video, as the start alludes to, I want to explore what happens when obsessions transform. When ideals become fanaticism and desires consume and corrupt completely. So let's get to it. Content warning. I'm going to talk a lot about Dark Souls, especially Dark Souls 3. Also, in that context, I'm going to talk about cannibalism, repulsive gluttony, and horrifying bestial transformations. We start in the lands of Dranglake of Dark Souls 2, of which the beautiful exterior hides a hideous truth. As we move from the serenity of Medusa, through the secret path to Huntsman's Corpse, and through the tortured undead and their skeleton lords, we get to the poisonous reaches of Harvest Valley. At the end of this valley, we find the first victim to their own obsessions. There once, long before the Harvest Valley turned into the poisonous wasteland we find it as, was a man whose deep feelings of affection were unrequited by the subject of his want. No matter how or how much he displayed his love, he was declined, even ignored by the one he so wished he could be with. Though his affection was never returned, it didn't ease his longing, and slowly, dangerously, his love turned into obsession. In a perversion of his unrelenting desires, he started to eat and eat and eat, almost mirroring the gluttony of the gaping dragon. Through his excessive eating, he, in time, bloated and transformed into the ravenous, covetous demon. A boss that is very much remembered for its pitiful attempts at stopping you, the bearer of the curse, but is easily defeated due to its pathetic slow attacks and short range. Like the gaping dragon, the covetous demon is designed around its main obsession. A giant mouth with sharp teeth, large arms to capture its meals, and a slimy, thinned and bloated legless body that elongates into a fat, rat-like tail. It looks like a horrible mix between a mole rat and a deep-sea fish. Kept at the base of the Earthen Peak Tower, he now seems more like a pitiful pet than the man he might once have been. And from this soul, the covetous demon soul, we learn of his loneliness. Still deprived of the affection that he so desperately wanted. Though now so close to her side. I can't help but pity him. How his desperation and desires consumed him so fully that it led him to ruin. From his name we can glean that he's cursed forever to consume and never be satisfied. His purpose of seeking the love that he couldn't have turned to bottomless despair that no gluttony could satiate. Who was this person of his mindless devotion? A person so deeply desired that a man would become a corrupt idol of a perverse desire, just for the fickle idea of her affection. A covetous demon. Who that once man wanted was the ruler of the very same tower that he now wastes away within. The ruler of Earthen Peak, Mytha, who was said to be the most beautiful queen in all of the land, but in a cruel and perhaps ironic kind of symmetry. Her own love was ignored by the very prince she was engaged with, and she so wished he would love her back. For how could he not, with all her beauty? When the prince, who would later become known as the Old Iron King, showed her no affection and instead loved another princess, Mytha was driven mad, and from her madness, the baneful queen was born. While Mytha was still human, in her maddened desperation, she sought to become even more beautiful, hoping that this would restore the prince's affection for her. But no matter what she did, her vanity did not change the prince. As her desperation grew, so did her ire. She enslaved the land and created mannequin slaves through the art of puppetry. She had undead slaves dig up the harvest valley for her to ingest in the poisonous substances of the earth. Substances which would supposedly be the means to increase her beauty, and thus, in her twisted belief, she would win the affection of her husband. However, over time, her toxic obsession with fickle vanity transformed her to the monstrous form she has today. As her attempts at attaining eternal beauty turned her monstrous instead, she tore off the heads of her mannequin slaves, for they must not gaze upon her monstrous form. A blasphemy to her former beauty. Small side note here. There's an interesting parallel to our own history in Mytha. Ingesting poisonous substances to become beautiful mirrors toxic cosmetics that have been used through the times. Anything from lead-based eyeliners, mineral arsenic in hair removal formulas, even ointments of mercury for skin ailments that would cause permanent damage over time. The idea of beauty and suffering is very intertwined, and the cost of beauty goes far back in history, with stories such as Narcissus and proverbs such as "no rose without a thorn" or "art demands sacrifice." It is nothing new that vanity can be costly. A clear message we can also see from Mytha's inspirations. Returning to Mytha, her monstrous form is clearly inspired by Medusa and the Gorgons of Greek myth. A beautiful woman turned serpentine monster, snake-like features that are often associated with both poison and desire. Mytha even hints to Medusa's own tragic end from the myths, as Mytha's head is already separated from her body, though still alive. This is speculated to have happened during the coup of the kingdom of Wen, or perhaps when her husband, the Old Iron King, saw what she had become. While Medusa is the tragic victim of the spiteful gods, Mytha is the victim to her own twisted and vain ideals. Ideals that tell her that beauty is everything.
That creature, she was human once, you know? Huh? In fact, she was wed to the prince of that nearby castle. But her husband, He had feelings for another. The princess was desperate and sought eternal beauty, hoping that it would restore the prince's affection. You see what I mean? Before long, the princess's ire transformed her into a monster.
She could not accept nor understand that her husband loved someone else, despite her overwhelming beauty, that there was something deeper. Disillusioned and misguided by her ideals, Mytha was more devoted to attain more physical attraction than understanding the very nature of the love that she so desperately wanted. I think that the poison Mytha ingested might have brought out her real inner monster. Her ire and wrath manifest, and her pursuit of beauty, a fickle, shallow attempt at trying to hide what she really was deep within. I think her magic puppetry of the mannequins reveals her need for control, and her act of ripping their heads off once she turned monstrous, a desperate denial, as she was the one supposedly looking at herself through the eyes of her puppets. Once her beauty couldn't sway the one she wanted, her true desperation started to bear its venomous fangs. It seems that Mytha, the baneful queen, drowned in her own shallow obsessions, consumed by a bitter pool of poison of her own making. Moving from Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 3, this next one brings us to the once great kingdom of Lothric and its ruler, Osiris, the consumed king. Osiris was not always this decaying imitation of a pale dragon we find him as. He was once the proud king and head of the royal family whose duty and desire it was to produce a worthy heir, to link the fire and prolong the age of fire. He married Guinevere. Yes, that Guinevere, whose illusion we find in Dark Souls 1, and conceived 2 sons. The divine princess of the kingdom, Lorien the knight and crown prince, and Lothric, named in a form of propaganda after the kingdom, and destined to become the Lord of Cinder, a sacrifice as fuel for the first flame. However, Lothric was born frail and sick, even once he reached adulthood, and in spite of blessings and royal treatment, he didn't outgrow his poor health. Thus, in a first transgression brought about by a twisted sense of purpose and duty, Osiris resorted to cursing the 2 princes, binding their souls together in an attempt to create a suitable soul to link the fire. Though their bound souls were now suitable as fuel, the 2 princes were unwilling to fulfill the destiny forced upon them, and retreated to their chambers waiting for the Age of Darkness to come. Frustrated by the continuous failures to uphold the royal family's duty, Osiris started to become more and more mad. A new fascination started to develop in his duty-bound mind, as his sanity was slowly replaced with insane obsession. Osiris became obsessed with cursed knowledge left behind in the grand archives by Seath the Scaleless, the pale traitor dragon who learned the magical secrets of moonlight and crystal-bound immortality. As Osiris became more and more obsessed, he came to be known as the Consumed King. In his cursed enlightenment, he believed that he needed to become a dragon like Seath to produce a crossbreed heir who would be strong enough to fulfill the royal duty. Through studying Zeus' sorcery and conducting twisted experimentation, as can be seen by the part-pale dragon wretches found in the Ereful dungeons, Osiris managed to fulfill his twisted transcendence. Though an imperfect and distorted pale dragon, Osiris was satiated, and thus fathered a new child with Guinevere. Yep, that happened. She quietly seemed to disappear after this happened, leaving Osiris to raise his destined heir by himself. That child was Ocelot, the child of dragons, who is the child that Osiris supposedly cradles in his clawed hands in the cutscene when you first meet his distorted, pale visage. Though, like his own transformation, the culmination of what he so desired seemed distorted. Having let his kingdom fall to ruin during his obsessive search for Zeus' secrets, everything he had worked for was in the palm of his clawed hand. But he was unable to see it. Unable to see Ocelot, his destined heir. So, I want to bring up a small point here. Some of you may know this already, but there's a bit of cut content here, as originally Osiris was actually holding a 3D model of a rather distorted baby. However, due to the nature of the fight, this was, probably for good reason considering age ratings, cut from the release. When you get Osiris beyond a certain health point threshold, he enters phase 2, which thematically means that he goes absolutely feral as a dragon, blinded by his own insanity and bestial tendencies, dropping his sorcerer's staff and smashing his claw into the ground. Yes, the claw which he was holding that baby with. Though Ocelot might not be visible, he isn't just a fragment of Osiris' twisted mind. And while we can actually hear Ocelot's cry throughout the fight, there are also some quite cool lore reasons for why it still makes sense, even though the original reason for his invisibility might be due to age ratings. Ocelot, though originating from his imperfect father, is supposedly a crossbreed. And we know from Priscilla, Zeus' crossbreed daughter, that she also had the ability to turn invisible. Though this fact might elude Osiris, it might be that Ocelot is simply using this ability innately, just like Priscilla could.
Dear little Ocelot, where have you gone? Are you hiding from me? Come out. Don't be afraid. You were born.
After so many years, so many trials and studies, Osiris had finally created his worthy heir, who could fulfill the destined royal duty that weighed so heavily on him. Only for the very means that led him to this end, to also be his frenzied downfall. Killing the very heir he had sacrificed everything for. Though Osiris' transformation was willing, others are more victims to their beastly transformations. In the snowy cold of Erefil of the Boreal Valley, we meet some of the mindless servants of tyrant Pontiff Suleiman. These monsters are known as just Suleiman's beasts, stripped of the titles they once had. They were once Erephilian knights, known as Outrider Knights. But when Pontiff Suleiman took over, he would send Outrider Knights out in order to infiltrate various areas in foreign campaigns. And while doing so, he would bestow them with enchanted rings. Rings known as the Left Eye Ring and Right Eye Ring, named for their deep black orb on top of the rings. Over time, these rings and their black eyes would frenzy and transform these Outrider Knights, fusing them with their armor and turning them into these beasts under the control of the pontiff himself, thus removing their means of desertion and the tragic loss of their own free will. What might have started as devotion to the Eryphilians, perhaps even their faith, or just a loyalty to a tyrant leader, was rewarded with their complete absorption into the pontiff's cruel control. And whatever the pontiff infused these rings with, it seems to carry the same madness and power that consumed the gaping dragon. The beast's stomachs and rib cages seem to have exploded into the same open toothed maw design. However, the rest of the design looks more canine and feral, akin to the beast of darkness from the Berserk manga, with their distorted glowing eyes and an elongated pointed mouth and snout akin to that of an alligator. With their long, coarse and matted fur and great clawed limbs, they possess an oppressive horror akin to many bloodborne beasts, which might be quite fitting as they also seem to be heavily inspired by Lovecraftian monsters called the Hounds of Tyndalos, which Sully the Witch explores brilliantly in this video. Beneath their ferocious exterior, a sliver of their humanity can still be seen when fighting them, knocking them down from a riposte, stopping their attacks afterwards. They can be seen to fold their hands in a prayer to whatever they still believe in, though I don't think they're praying to the pontiff any longer. While these beasts might pray for some kind of salvation, I hope their prayers are less depraved than those of the archdeacon right next to them. Guarded by two of Sullivan's beasts, we find the remains of an archdeacon, Archdeacon MacDonald. Though dead, he manages the covenant of Aldrich's faithful and gives rewards to the true followers of Aldrich. To advance in the covenant, you have to offer up human dregs to the archdeacon. But what are human dregs exactly? Well, it is a bit esoteric, but they're described as the heaviest things within the human body that will sink to the lowest depths imaginable, and as great dark souls dregs that have stewed for ages far within the deep. And the deep, well, the deep seems to be a corrupt, stagnant, murky version of the abyss, which is a realm stemming from the original dark soul. Where the abyss would generate life such as the humanity phantoms, the deep seems to create insect-like creatures such as the locusts, maggots, and insects from the Gnaw miracle, but also rotten creatures inspired by the depths of the ocean, such as the barnacled merkmen. The deep and its human dregs seems to be the decrepit, most rotten parts of the human soul, the vile sediment of humanity that like stagnant waters collect as sludge in the depths. Though it is hard to tell from the lore, it seems that the deep might once have been a serene and peaceful place, but due to the cleansing rituals it might have washed away more corruption than it could hold. Thus, like the cathedral, it once served a sacred purpose, but both are now home to abhorrent monstrosities. What I'm building up here is the question of why an archdeacon would be interested in collecting these vile, profane things. Isn't he supposed to be a man of faith? Well, he once was, and he was part of the blessed Way of White, a covenant and organization who venerated the gods of Analondo, Lord Gwyn, and his children. The Way of White are known for clerics, blessed knights, and healing miracles. It was also the Way of the White that founded the Cathedral of the Deep, a place of purification of the stagnant darkness within the blood of infected humans, extracted using notched whips in the cleansing chapel, using the sacred waters to wash over it. Over time, assumingly affected by the ever-growing stagnation of the world due to the continued prolonging of the Age of Fire, the horrors that slumber in the deep grew larger. As described by the Deep Ring, in the cathedral slumber things most terrible, and as such the deacons require a grand narrative to ensure they do not falter in their duty, a philosophy to ward away the madness beckoned by the grotesqueries at hand. The work of the deacons required them to meet the wildness of the stagnant deep head-on. Though Archdeacon MacDonald was a man of the cloth, he found delight in the stagnated souls, believing them to be the foundation of the world. As he began devoting himself to the deep, likely influenced by a depraved cleric named Aldrich, who had a taste for human flesh and had risen to profane prominence within the cathedral and as a follower of the deep, MacDonald started converting the clerics and deacons of the cathedral. Even Archdeacon Royce and Archdeacon Klimt succumbed and became followers of the deep and MacDonald's ideals. The Deep Braille Divine Tome further documents this transformation from the divine to the profane. The power of this cult only grew once Aldrich decided to link the flame, turning him into the saint of the deep. As the deacons began partaking in the profane rituals of the deep, they let the dregs take hold within them, turning their skin a disheveled dark grey, their robes torn, and their cathedral filthy and welcoming of the horrors of the deep. Archdeacon Royce and his congregation of deacons are found at Aldrich's immense coffin, now a sacred place for the cult. While I don't think the deacons are as interesting in their design as some of the other monsters, I think that they, together with the deep and the cathedral as a whole, make for an interesting story of corruption through fanaticism and distortion of faith. I think that the design of the cathedral's open space filled with water and corrupted sludge tells a story of how the cleansing waters became more and more corrupt with time, and as the waters became polluted, so did their faith. While some of the deacons stayed at the cathedral of the deep and the empty sacred sarcophagus of Aldrich, Archdeacon MacDonald returned to Iroquois with Aldrich to help him with his plans. Returning back to the water reserve below the ruins of Anolondo, we can look at MacDonald's bloated remains. I think it is easy to think that Archdeacon MacDonald partook in Aldrich's profane communion of cannibalism, and like Aldrich, bloated like a drowned pig.
Take Aldrich for one, a right and proper cleric, only he developed a habit of devouring men. He ate so many that he bloated like a drowned pig, then softened into sludge, so they stuck him in the cathedral of the deep.
We know from Aldrich's ruby and sapphire rings that Aldrich shared his vile desires with others, some transforming more drastically through the consumption of human flesh and the connection with the deep. Perhaps Aldrich took some notes from the magic rings that the pontiff used for his subjects. It is unclear how Archdeacon MacDonald died, but perhaps over time the deep consumed him from within, now allowing only his consumed soul to continue his duty to Aldrich's covenant. Perhaps he awaits the age of the deep that he so believed Aldrich would bring. Much like the deacons that Aldrich corrupted, Aldrich was also once a man of the cloth, and a cleric of the Way of the White from Iroquois. However, the depraved Aldrich took pleasure in a dark, twisted habit. Aldrich took deep pleasure in the profane communion of devouring humans, savoring their lost screams. Aldrich's depraved habits got him exiled to the Cathedral of the Deep, in the hopes that the rituals of purification could contain and cure his perverse and profane cravings. Though it is unclear how, Aldrich's full embrace of these profane acts must have seemed divine to the deacons at the cathedral, as they started to help feed Aldrich's repulsive gluttony, rather than stopping it. Maybe the deacons were already more affected by the dark dregs of the deep than they knew at this point, or maybe they saw the depravity of the deep within Aldrich as something of a divine message. And the effects of the deep probably empowered Aldrich's dark sensations even more. His gluttony was so immense that it turned Aldrich into a gooey, sludge-like mass of darkness and flesh. As he continued to gorge himself on humans, children, even his own progeny, Aldrich gained an immense amount of power. Enough power that he could sacrifice himself to link the flame. And so he did, for an age. When later, the Princes Lothric and Lorien refused to extend the Age of Fire, Aldrich, together with the other former Lords of Cinder, were exhumed to once again be fuel. Aldrich declined, as he could feel that a great Age of the Deep was coming, and he would help it along by devouring the old gods who still protected the Age of Fire. Now, with a cult following of deacons, Aldrich marched on Irithyll, overthrowing Pontiff Sullivan and striking a deal. The Pontiff would maintain some control, while Aldrich would gain access to the old cathedral of Analondo, where the old god and chief deity, Gwyndolin, was imprisoned. And it is here that Aldrich would start his long feast of a god. When we, as the Ashen One, find Aldrich in the old cathedral, we're met with this ruined grand cathedral, now filled with a sludge-like substance that is part of Aldrich's very body. I could not imagine the horrid smell of decay in that room. More tangible is the puppeteering of Gwyndolin's body, which Aldrich uses to cast sorceries and miracles in the fight. Gwyndolyn's body is attached to this meat-like appendage that seemingly has protruding ribs, hair and sinew. Whether this is Aldrich's stomach, mouth or otherwise, I cannot tell. However, the mask somehow reminds me of the amalgamation of death that is Gravelord Nito from Dark Souls 1, with the bones of past meals floating in the sludge of the battleground. Aldrich, encompassing the whole room, can dive into the sludge of the floor in order to move around the room, as the meaty appendage holding the body of a god also seems to be the most vital one for him to protect. Aldrich's design reminds me of something that should not exist, or be able to retain its ability to live. He has no mouth, but yet he feasts. As if his profane acts not only has dissolved his humanity, but his body too. Yes, I think dissolved is the best wording I can come up with. Dissolved due to a natural body not being able to withstand the immense, raw blasphemy of its own profane existence. And now he's performing his greatest act of mockery. For can anything be of greater blasphemy for a cleric than eating a god? And in some ways, Aldrich reminds me of a certain lord in Elden Ring. Though Aldrich would go on to eat a god, the demigod Lord Rykard would offer himself to be eaten by the blasphemous serpent of Mount Gelmir, merging with it. In that way, both Aldrich and Lord Rykard embraced blasphemy, fully aware of what they were doing. Aldrich was no victim to anything but his own full embrace of the profane, the corrupt and the perverse. Though he was a Lord of Cinder, I believe He sacrificed himself to the linking of the fire not out of honor or grand belief, but to prove his profane ideals powerful, mocking the virtues of the holy and divine. It would be interesting to know how one such as Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, started his very first profane acts, and why he was so compelled to do so. All of these monsters were once driven by purpose. A purpose that by one reason or another twisted itself into obsession. Obsessions that have both transformed and consumed their very being. Some, like Mitha and the covetous demon, became victims to their own twisted desires turned dangerous hunger and ire. Osiris, on the other hand, was a mind broken by a duty heavier than he could bear. Some say the ends justify the means. But what if the means end up changing the ends? What if, blinded by the means of the pursuit, you pass the very goal you sought to reach? Though Osiris successfully transformed and fathered a crossbreed heir, his insanity cost him his kingdom, his wife, and the future of his sons. And in the end it cost him everything he had worked so long for. For others, the transformation happens slowly, and then all at once. It can be hard to discern devotion from fanaticism when you are blinded by faith, zeal, or duty. What the Outrider Knights did out of devotion they paid for in absolute enslavement, and what the deacons fought for ages to contain and purify became their collective delusion, a complete devotion to the very oblivion they once opposed. Nietzsche said, "He who fights with monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." Perhaps the deep they fought for ages had stared deeply into their very beings for too long. Aldrich might just have been the catalyst for the depravity to finally take root above the sacred waters. And finally, Aldrich, who gazed the furthest into the dark of the abyss, and seemed to embrace it so deeply, never looking away. I think that makes Aldrich the most consumed of all. His belief in his ideals was so absolute that he would become a saint to what he believed to be the order of the world. Whatever purpose that drove Aldrich, the darkness of the deep must have taken a fathomless dark hold of his soul, and never faltered. What began as depraved pleasure became a dark revelation, a blasphemous crusade to eat a god, and usher in a new age of profane depravity. So be wary not to mistake obsession for passion, fanaticism for devotion, or compulsion for intention, lest you lose control and be consumed by what you seek. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and consider subscribing if you like this type of content. It helps me a whole lot. I really wanted to try my hands at a slightly longer video this time around, so please let me know in the comments whether you liked it or not. If you feel like you could need some more, I've written a little supplementary article that dives into Pontiff Sullivan. I'll put the link in the description down below. Also, I don't intend for these videos to only be Dark Souls monsters or even only From Software monsters. I would love to bring in other monster designs and their backgrounds in time, but I would probably still prioritize monsters with some sort of lore or background. I'd like to think of how the narrative and inspirations affect their designs. Also, thank you guys so much for the support. We reached the goal of 150 subscribers before the end of October, so that is awesome. Thank you so much. I don't know if I dare set a goal for 400 subscribers before the end of the year, but that would be some amazing growth. But it would very much depend on how well this and the next video performs. My fingers stay crossed. That's it for now. Thanks for joining me, and so long until I find you again.